It's now my great pleasure to introduce or reintroduce Nicole, Jem, Anna and Stephanie. They're really wonderful musicians, and I think more important than that, really lovely people. I mean that sincerely. As I've got older, I've come to the conclusion that I only really want to work with people who are very nice. And Nicole, the person I know particularly, is truly a lovely person and a wonderful musician. And we're so thrilled, the four of you, that you are here to play this beautiful music. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Seamus. I have to confess that I am not a descendant with any family connection to the Dunera or Queen Mary stories, but I am a musician, and as an industry sector, we are people who have been touched by the Dunera story through many of the companies in the sector, Musica Viva Australia, many of the post-war musical institutions in Australia are the direct result of migration from the Dunera and Queen Mary. So I have to say thank you as one of those third generation musicians post-1945. I'm going to talk about Max Peter Meyer, who is the composer aboard the Dunera, who composed this piano quartet that we're going to play this afternoon. He was born in Munich in 1892 and died in Bavaria in 1950. He worked in the Bavarian town of Oberammergau before the war. He was one of the oldest of the Dunera men to be transported to Australia and one of the very few who returned to his original area of residence after the war. He was raised in a family typical of many in Germany, learning piano, organ and composition as an essential part of his childhood education, although his professional training post-school was in finance. The scholar Albrecht Dumling comments in his 2016 book about Jewish musicians exiled in Australia, which is called The Vanished Musicians, and is fantastic. It's in both German and English for anybody who's interested in this topic. That the people persecuted by the Nazi regime included, and I quote, far more musicians than those who were politically persecuted, a fact that is explained by the high standing in which musical education and Bildung, or indirect translation culture, were held by German and Austrian Jewry. They valued the art of music, glorified by composer Franz Schubert in his famous setting of Franz Schauber's poem An die Musik, to music, as a particularly suitable means of approaching German culture as a key to the German soul. So Meyer then was one of the many culturally Jewish Bavarians who'd married into the Roman Catholic faith before the 1930s. He'd also served for the Red Cross during the First World War and had been extremely traumatised. It seems that this is what led him to his work in music eventually, serving the community and probably a little acceptance in his small Roman Catholic community in Oberammergau in the 1920s. This wish for music to alleviate trauma and provide sustenance in hard times also seems to have been the reason for much of his composition and music leadership during his Dunera years. The worsening political situation during the 30s prompted Meyer to apply for a visa to the USA, but unfortunately it didn't prevent him from being swept up by the events of Kristallnacht. He was imprisoned in Dachau, but through his efforts and luck in obtaining a visa, was released on the condition of his leaving Germany. His wife was not allowed to travel with him. Like many others, Meyer got stuck in England en route to the US. Rounded up by Britain in June 1940, he spent his time at the Isle of Man, but also Kitchener camps, where he met many of the other musicians associated with these Dunera and Queen Mary stories. His time in England before internment in the late 30s was one of trying to stay employed as a musician, and there's further evidence of him composing and teaching in several rural areas, as well as studying at the London College of Music, which is now part of the University of West London. There are more compositions from this time in England, including masses especially written for children, another 2 piano quartets and a string quartet, all seemingly aimed at use by community rather than professional musicians. These manuscripts are in the Vienna State Library. My connection to this piano quartet, which was written in 1941 in Tatura, we're still not sure if it was performed at the many chamber music evenings that were held there in the camp, where there were string quartets by Beethoven, Schubert, Mozart, quartets by Brahms, Reinberger, all performed, as well as the cabaret style of performance as well. Maya had been in charge of a lot of the choral music for the Catholics in camp, and he's mostly famous for the Dunera Mass, which he composed aboard the ship en route to Australia. He'd been in Camp 8 at Hay and in a hut with other Roman Catholics, including 2 teenage brothers from Vienna, Oswald and Christoph Wolkenstein, who were some of the youngest. They were 16 and 18 aboard the Dunera. It was years later, in 2002, at Holy Family Church, Lindfeld, where this once young man, Ozzy Wolkenstein now, who was then in his 80s, I think, were parishioners, and my father, Dr. Jim Forsyth, was the music director at Holy Family Lindfield, and he had a lovely choir of community music making people, just like all of you, who decided to come along and be in a choir for him. And I used to get orchestras together out of my friends from Sydney Conservatorium of Music when I was a student. And apparently Ozzy had sat there and listened to this and thought, well, gee, that sounds like some of the things that we did in my youth in Vienna as a child. He played flute as a boy, and also some of the choral and instrumental evenings that he'd participated in during his time in internment in Hay and Tatura. So Ozzy decided that my dad, Jim, was going to be the best guardian for a whole package of music that he came over, and Dad was sitting at the organ one day and Ozzy said, here you are, this is a package of music by my Professor Max Peter Meyer, and I'd like you to look after it and perform it. So it turns out that one of the pieces in this package was a manuscript edition, handwritten in Tatura, by Max Peter Meyer of this piano quartet that we're going to play now. It seems to have been Ozzy's way of bringing the manuscripts home to a place that they'd be performed and heard in a community again. So thank you for being here this afternoon. It's an intangible piece of heritage. So history for us doesn't exist until it's played and heard. And I think the wonderful thing about music is that it can be heard by anybody who speaks any language at all. So it really is the universal language. We think that this is Meyer's way of bringing the idea of Heimat, home, Germanness, back into the camp. So see if you can hear the references to Brahms in the first movement, the references perhaps to Schubert's Trout Quintet in the fourth movement. In the Minuet third movement, there's a bit where you can hear the Bavarian countryside. There's a Ländler dance, and we think the cowbells chiming. And there's also a little bit of a reference to a Mahler folk song in there. And then in the second movement, he's referenced the Abendlied, or the German lullaby, and I'll quote from the Abendlied: "The moon is risen beaming, the golden stars are gleaming so brightly in the sky, the hushed black woods are dreaming, the mists like phantoms seeming from meadows magically rise. How still the world reposes, while twilight round it closes, so peaceful and so fair. A quiet room for sleeping, into oblivion sleeping, the day's distress and sober care." We hope you enjoy our performance of Max Peter Meyer's Piano Quartet in C major. Thank you.